Joe Biden said that Putin is a war criminal. Like, give me a fucking break, man. You're a war criminal, Joe. Did you forget? Get on your fucking meds to remember the war crimes that you did. That's a good thing to talk about. So Russia's retreat from the outskirts of Kiev revealed like a bunch of what certainly looks like war crimes, like random civilians with their hands tied and shit. Though Zelensky is calling it a genocide, which doesn't make sense. But like, it's obvious they committed war crimes. There's not really any need for me to talk about them, because if you want to know about them, just fucking Google. You know, don't get your news from me. But I can at least offer some level of commentary based on that tidbit. Like, the announcements of this really show that the world, or at least the so-called free world, has the capacity to denounce these sorts of things. They just choose not to. They just choose to do it when it's convenient for them. Like, Joe fucking Biden called Putin a war criminal. Joe, I know that you don't know where you are, but in case you've forgotten, you were a war criminal. You've supported every single US war basically ever since you've been in office. You were the VP under Obama. How many war crimes did you fucking have a direct hand in, my man? When people like call this shit, saying this shit whataboutism, like, dude, when someone who is a war criminal calls someone else a war criminal and you're like, dude, you're a war criminal, that's not whataboutism. That's like just pointing out the most obvious like hypocrisy, the most obvious conflict of interest, the most obvious dishonesty imaginable. People like saying like, Viktor Orban should be kicked out of, like, Hungary should be kicked out of the EU and NATO and shit like that because he said that Zelensky is his enemy or something and he's taking Ukrainian refugees but not directly sending arms to Ukraine or whatever. Dude, why not kick Orban out of the EU for, like, being a massive fucking racist who, like, refused tons of refugees and shit and spread, like, anti-refugee hysteria? Why not kick France out of the EU for bombing Libya? Honestly, the whole thing like doesn't make any sense. Like, why not kick the US out of NATO then? If we're talking about like tacitly maybe supporting war crimes in a really indirect way, what about the US literally invading a bunch of countries? What about NATO supporting them in that invasion in Afghanistan? What about NATO bombing Libya? And I'm literally saying, what about? Yeah, it's not whataboutism, because the thing that we're talking about here is people are like, we need to get rid of this guy because he's not denouncing these war crimes as hard enough. Well, that's not a standard that your bloc has, because in the past you've never done that. Obviously, you don't care about the war crimes. You don't give a fucking shit about war crimes. You're just weaponizing them because in this case they're convenient for you. The state, like the government that's committing the war crimes, is one that is like your geopolitical enemy rather than you. So it's time to be against war crimes in this isolated circumstance. But I guess when Ukraine sent troops to contribute to the criminal war in Iraq, that wasn't them being complicit in war crimes. When NATO committed to the invasion of Afghanistan with the USA to defend the USA, I guess no war crimes involved there. When NATO bombed the fuck out of Libya, I guess no war crimes there. Or at least not war crimes that we got to care about. Like, the level of complicity here, we're talking about like direct participation in war crimes versus Viktor Orban arguably like tacitly endorsing another country's war crimes. Not the same thing at all. But now the Europeanoids are outraged. Give me a fucking break. The saddest thing about the Ukrainian invasion, aside from the fact that Ukraine is being fucking utterly decimated by Russia, is the fact that it's showing us that these people have the capacity to at least pretend to care about those things as a massive bloc. Like, people are like, Russia needs to be expelled from the UN Security Council, from the UN Human Rights Council, from even the UN entirely, from all of these fucking things. If we applied these standards to the prime advocates for this, each and every single one of them would be fucking deleted off the world with the shit that they've done in very recent times too. But obviously, what this is all about is, you know, the fact that an enemy is doing it this time. You pretend to care about these things, about these atrocities, only when enemies are doing them. This is geopolitics, basically what real politics is. It's funny because these people, like, if you confront them on this sort of thing, and they're not literally like Joe fucking Biden, who obviously would never admit to this, and you confront them on this and you're like, hey, it's kind of weird that you're an American, right? And you literally endlessly talk about Russia, China, their atrocities, their crimes, etc. But somehow you never talk about your own country. You never talk about your own country in these same terms. And then in that situation, you back them into a corner, and they're like, well, mention a US atrocity and I'll denounce it. That's not the point, though. You're applying your outrage selectively. You're picking and choosing like what to emphasize, what not to, what to largely ignore until you're forced to engage with it. And the very fact that like you don't give a fucking single fucking shit about what the US, what Europe, etc. does until someone else brings it up in a situation that you would like to usually try to dismiss as being just whataboutism. That shows what it's all about, really. It's about not actually having consistent politics and consistent standards at all, and just being concerned with maintaining Western hegemony, maintaining Western capitalist hegemony over the third world, maintaining the system of global exploitation that is Western-backed neoliberalism the world over. Otherwise, you wouldn't fucking be picking and choosing what to hyperfocus on. Especially being an American. God, like as an American, there is no fucking excuse to like not have spoken about things like the Yemen war literally constantly. If you have 50 videos on Ukraine and you don't have 50 videos on Yemen, which has been going on for much longer and has killed far more people and is far more fucking unjust and terrible, it's pretty obvious what your real agenda is. And these people just call this whataboutism. Basically for them, any mention of that clear hypocrisy, of that clear cynicism, of the obvious fact that they are just weaponizing something that they don't genuinely care about at all because it's convenient for them against a geopolitical enemy is dismissible with a single word that they learn from like a Reddit comment or something. Like whataboutism is just an excuse for people who clearly have inconsistent beliefs, who are clearly massive hypocrites, who are clearly just invested in campism for a certain geopolitical bloc, who dismiss anyone pointing that out offhandedly, to not have to deal with the facts at hand that prove that about them. Fucking Joe Biden, like calling someone else a war criminal just has to be the epitome of this sort of thing. Jesus Christ. Joe Biden is a war criminal. Russia should be kicked out of all of these international blocs. Apply that to the EU and the US, and all of that applies 20 fucking times over. But of course, you'd never hear them advocating for that in those cases. And the only time where they might is if you get them into like a gotcha situation where you mention this inconsistency, and they might be like, but I would definitely do that. I would definitely advocate for that. Of course, they would never do it of their own volition. They would just like say that in the moment so they don't have to actually admit their inconsistency and their massively disproportionate hyperfocus on countries on the other side of the world that they can't meaningfully influence in any way rather than their own, which they can, and their own, which is far worse. Fucking Joe Biden's calling someone else a war criminal. Give me a break. Yeah, the very origin of the whataboutism thing, like that the people who like the term like to say is that when the USA would criticize the Soviet Union would say that the US oppresses black people, lynches them. And it's like, actually, yeah, that's a good point. Maybe you shouldn't criticize another country for supposed human rights abuses when your country is literally mass murdering people on a racial basis. Maybe it's a good idea to keep your shit to yourself in that situation and work on your own problems. That's actually a great fucking point. You are a massive hypocrite there. It's not so much a deflection as it is a valid point. Like the very nature of the whole whataboutism is an evil Russian Soviet propaganda tactic. It's just bullshit in the first place. Maybe before you worry about hyper-exaggerated human rights abuses in countries on the other side of the world that just so happen to be your main geopolitical rivals, you should worry about your own proven human rights abuses at home, which are, in many cases, far worse. Give me a fucking break. That is a legitimate point. And that goes for Western leftists in general too. It's as Chomsky says, the reason why he focuses on the US is because he's American. You would expect a Russian anti-imperialist to focus more on Russian imperialism. And when you have a bunch of supposedly leftist Americans who aren't doing that for their own imperialism, who instead are hyper-focusing on Russia and China, it really gives the game away. And other official enemies of the US, it gives the game away so obviously. You couldn't be more obvious about what their real agenda is, what their real beliefs are, regardless of how much they try to hide it, regardless of how much they'll performatively denounce the US if you ask them about it, but they'll never talk about it of their own volition.